The day my father's will was read, my brother didn't even bother to wear a suit. He showed up in a quarter zip and jeans like it was a Saturday trip to Canadian Tire. I remember thinking, that's how little this means to him. Or maybe that's how certain he was about the outcome. I've been living in my parents' house in Courthouse for the past 3 years. Not because I had nowhere else to go. I had a decent job, a lease I could have renewed, friends who kept asking when I was moving back into the city. But my father had been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's at 61, and my mother had passed 2 years before that from a stroke she never fully recovered from, and someone had to be there. My brother was in Vancouver. He had a startup he kept describing as pre-revenue and a girlfriend who posted a lot about manifesting. He sent money twice. Not regularly. Twice. I was the one who drove my father to the Queensway Carlton every other week. I was the one who learned how to manage his medication schedule, who called his neurologist when he started having falls, who sat with him through the nights he couldn't sleep because his hands wouldn't stop trembling and he didn't want to be alone with that. I quit freelancing full-time and picked up part-time remote work so I could be home by 3. I stopped dating anyone seriously because every time I tried, there was a call, a fall, a medication change that needed monitoring. I am not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I am telling you this because what happened next only makes sense if you understand what I gave up, and what my brother understood about all of it, which was nothing, apparently. My father passed on a Tuesday in October. He went quietly, which the hospice nurse said was a mercy. I held his hand. My brother arrived on Wednesday afternoon, 2 hours after the funeral home came. He hugged me in the kitchen and said, "I'm really glad he had you." I didn't say anything back. I made coffee. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday at a law office in downtown Ottawa. My father's lawyer, a man named Whitfield, who had handled his affairs for years, had called me personally to let me know the time. My brother had apparently already spoken with Whitfield's office twice that week. I know because the receptionist mentioned it when I called to confirm. I didn't think much of it then. I was grieving. I was exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I was also dealing with the logistics that fall on whoever is present. The death certificates, the bank notifications, the calls to Service Canada, the boxes of medical equipment that needed to be returned. My brother took his father's watch from the nightstand on Thursday and left for Vancouver on Friday to sort some things out. He said he'd be back for Monday. He was. Quarter zip, jeans, a coffee from Second Cup that he didn't offer to get for me. Whitfield's office was on Elgin Street, one of those older buildings with dark wood paneling and bookshelves that are mostly for show. There was a woman at the front desk who brought us water without being asked. I remember being grateful for that small thing. Whitfield came in and set a folder on the table. He looked at both of us over his glasses and said he was sorry for our loss, and then he opened the folder. My father's estate included the house in Courthouse, which had no mortgage. He and my mother had paid it off years ago. There was a savings account with the Bank of Nova Scotia, a modest RRSP, and a small investment portfolio through a financial advisor he'd been working with since the 90s. In total, somewhere around $800,000 in assets, not counting the house, which had been assessed the previous spring at just over $600,000. I expected the house to go to both of us equally. That's what my father had always said. Split down the middle, figure it out, be fair to each other. He told me that more than once while I was still living there, and I had no reason to doubt him. Whitfield read through the will. The investment portfolio and RRSP were split equally. The savings account, equally. And then he got to the house. The house, according to the document on the table, was to go entirely to my brother. I heard it, and then I needed a moment to make sure I'd heard it correctly. Whitfield confirmed it. He said there had been an amendment to the will filed 8 months prior, the previous February, that had changed the property distribution. The original will had left the house jointly. The amendment left it to my brother alone, with a note that I was to be permitted to remain as a tenant for up to 6 months at fair market value. Fair market value. For the home I had lived in for 3 years to care for our father. My brother took a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't look at me. I asked Whitfield when exactly this amendment had been filed. He told me February 14th. I asked who had initiated it. He said it had been requested by my father. I didn't say anything for a long time. My brother started talking. Something about logistics, timelines, what was reasonable for the transition period. I sat there and thought about February. My father in February had been having significant difficulty with his hands. He had started struggling with the tablet I'd set up for him to video call his friends. He sometimes forgot what day it was. He had never, in any conversation with me, mentioned wanting to change his will. He had never suggested he was unhappy with the original arrangement. We talked openly. He told me he worried about me not having enough of a life outside of his care. He never once said anything about the house. I went home that afternoon and I sat in the kitchen of the house that was no longer mine, and I tried to think clearly. Something wasn't right. I knew it the way you know things when you've spent 3 years paying close attention to someone. Their habits, their capacity, their patterns. My father in February was not a man who would have quietly overhauled his estate plan without mentioning it to anyone. Certainly not without mentioning it to me. I started going through things methodically. It's not something I planned. It was more that I couldn't sleep, and when I can't sleep, I tend to organize. I went through the filing cabinet in my father's office first. Bills, warranties, insurance documents, tax records going back 15 years, and then I found something that confused me, a printed email thread between my brother and Whitfield's office, dated January of that year, that had been filed in the wrong folder. My brother had initiated contact with Whitfield directly. He had asked questions about estate amendments and what was required to make changes to an existing will. Whitfield's response was professionally neutral. He'd outlined the process, noted that any changes required the testator's direct instruction and a capacity assessment if there was any question. I photographed every page. The next morning, I called the office of the registered nurse who had been doing my father's in-home assessments since November. I asked her if she had any documentation from around February regarding his cognitive state. She said she could have his file notes sent to me and that she was sorry for my loss. When the notes came through, they were careful and clinical, but clear. In her assessment from early February, she had noted that my father was experiencing moderate cognitive fluctuation and had flagged concerns about his ability to manage complex financial decisions independently. She had recommended that major decisions be deferred or made with family oversight. That document had never been shared with Whitfield's office. I don't know how long I sat at the kitchen table after I read that. Long enough that the coffee went cold. I kept thinking about my brother calling Whitfield in January. I kept thinking about the amendment dated February 14th. I kept thinking about my father, who loved his house and always said he wanted it to stay in the family, not be a transaction. I contacted a lawyer the next week, not through anyone my brother knew. I found her through a referral. A woman named Fernandez, who specialized in estate disputes and had an office in Central Town. I laid everything out for her, the amendment, the email thread, the nurse's assessment, the timeline. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "This is worth pursuing." She explained that an estate amendment could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. Given the nurse's documented concerns from the same period, we had a reasonable foundation. She filed a notice of dispute with the estate within the window required under Ontario's Succession Law Reform Act. My brother called me that evening. He had received the notification. He did not sound like someone caught off guard. He sounded like someone who had prepared for this. He said I was making a mistake, that I was grieving and not thinking clearly, that Dad had made his wishes known and it wasn't my place to override them. He said I had 6 months to find somewhere else and he hoped I would use the time wisely. I said, "Okay," and hung up. He didn't usually send more Kadri the emails. He didn't usually send more Kadri the nursing notes. He didn't know that Fernandez had already submitted a request for the capacity documentation that Whitfield had been required to obtain before witnessing the amendment documentation that, as it turned out, either did not exist or had not been properly completed. I kept going to work. I kept the house clean. I cooked dinner and watched the news and called my friend and Barry on weekends the way I always had. I did not tell anyone what was happening except Fernandez, not because I was hiding it, because I had learned in 3 years of caregiving that you save your energy for what actually matters. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in March at the Superior Court of Justice on Elgin Street, not far from where Whitfield's office was. I remember the morning clearly. It had snowed overnight, one of those late March snows that's already half slush by 9 in the morning, and I left early to give myself time to walk without rushing. There's a stretch of sidewalk near the Tom Brown Arena where the snowmelt drains badly and the pavement turns into a river for about 3 weeks every spring. I'd been navigating it since I was a kid. I was stepping around a Y puddle when I almost walked into an older man who had stopped on the sidewalk. He was in a wheelchair, one of the manual ones, older model, and the front wheel had caught in a crack in the pavement, where the frost heave had lifted the concrete about 2 inches. He couldn't get the chair over it without tipping forward. I asked if I could help. He looked at me and said that would be very kind. I got behind the chair and tilted it back just enough to clear the crack, then guided him forward. He was wearing a good winter coat, navy blue, and a scarf that looked like it had been through a few decades. His gloves were mismatched. He thanked me and asked where I was headed. I said, to the courthouse on Elgin. He said, what a coincidence. So am I. He told me his name was Walter. I told him mine. He asked if I wanted to walk together since we were going the same direction and he didn't love navigating alone on wet pavement. I said of course. We walked slowly. He asked what brought me to court and I gave him the short version. My father had passed. There was a dispute over the estate. I was contesting a will amendment. He nodded and asked a few questions that were more specific than I expected. About the timeline, about how the amendment had been filed, about whether capacity documentation had been obtained. I answered them. He listened carefully. When we got to the building, he thanked me again. I held the door. We went through security together and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. My brother was already there, in the corridor outside the courtroom. He was with a lawyer, someone I didn't recognize, expensive haircut, a briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to. My brother saw me and then saw Walter, and his expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. Dismissive, maybe. He looked at Walter's mismatched gloves and the older wheelchair and made some remark to his lawyer, quiet enough that I didn't catch the words, but loud enough that he meant me to see him saying something. Walter gave no indication he noticed. We went in. Fernandez was already at our table. She stood when I came in and gave me a look that said she was ready. I sat down and arranged my folder. Across the aisle, my brother sat with his lawyer and looked like a man who expected this to be over by lunch. The judge came in. The clerk called the case. And then Fernandez stood up and asked if the court would recognize the presence of a senior member of the Law Society of Ontario who had been consulted in relation to the conduct of the filing attorney in this matter. The judge asked who that was. Walter rolled forward. He was, as it turned out, a retired Superior Court judge who had spent the last several years on the Law Society's discipline committee. He had been contacted by a colleague of Fernandez's who knew him personally. He had reviewed the file. He had noted that the capacity documentation required under standard practice for the amendment in question was either absent or irregular. He had also noted that the communication between my brother and Whitfield, initiating discussion of the amendment before any instruction from my father was documented, raised questions that the committee would be reviewing separately. My brother's lawyer asked for a recess. The judge denied it. What followed was not dramatic in the way courtrooms are on television. It was slow, methodical, and mostly procedural. But by the end of the afternoon, the amendment had been suspended pending a full review. The original will was reinstated as the governing document, and Whitfield had been placed on notice by the Law Society. My brother's lawyer spent most of the second half of the session taking notes very quickly and speaking to my brother in low, urgent tones. My brother looked at me once, near the end. I didn't look away first. In the weeks after, Fernandez walked me through what the full resolution meant. The estate was to be distributed according to the original will, the house jointly to both of us. My brother and I would need to either agree on a buyout or list the property. We agreed, eventually, on a buyout. I bought out his half. I know how that sounds. Buying out someone who tried to take everything. But the house is where my father lived. It's where I spent 3 years of my life. I wanted it to be mine cleanly, without conditions. The Law Society investigation into Whitfield concluded several months later. He received a formal reprimand and a supervision order. He did not lose his license, which Fernandez told me was within the range of possible outcomes and not unusual for a first finding. I was disappointed. She said that was also a normal response. My brother and I have not spoken since the buyout was finalized. He sent one message, the day the paperwork cleared, that said, "I hope you're happy." I read it and set my phone down and made dinner. I think about Walter sometimes. I looked him up after everything was over. Not difficult. His name is in public records from his years on the bench. He had a long career. He is the kind of person who, if you described him to someone who'd never met him, they might say he sounds like a character from a novel. Mismatched gloves, cracked pavement, the right courthouse on the right morning. I sent him a card. He wrote back on paper in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven. He said he was glad it had worked out, and that in his experience, people who pay attention usually find what they need when they need it. My father used to say something similar in his own way. He used to say, the people who show up are the ones who matter. He meant it about caregiving, about being present during hard times. But I think it applies more broadly than that. I still live in the house in Kanata. I painted the kitchen last spring, a color my father would have called too bold, which means I probably got it right. His things are still mostly where he left them. I'm not in a hurry to change everything. Some mornings I sit at the table with my coffee and I think about February 14th, and about what my brother thought he understood about our father, and about what he understood about me. He thought I was tired and sad and too busy grieving to pay attention. He was right about the first two, he was wrong about the last one. I was paying attention the whole time. I think about the morning of the hearing more than I expected to, not the courtroom part, the walk there, the slush, the cracked pavement near Tom Brown, the front wheel of Walter's chair catching in the frost heave. That moment when I stopped and helped him over it without really thinking about it. I wasn't doing it to get anything. I was just a person on a sidewalk who saw someone who needed a hand. That's the part I keep coming back to. My brother had spent months constructing something carefully. He'd made calls, asked the right questions, waited for the right window when our father was vulnerable. He had a plan, a lawyer, a timeline. And what did I have? I had 3 years of showing up when it was hard and unglamorous, and nobody was watching. I had a filing cabinet I'd gone through at midnight because I couldn't sleep. I had paid close enough attention to know when something was wrong, even when every part of me was exhausted and grieving and wanted to believe things were straightforward. That kind of attention doesn't come from nowhere. You build it slowly, through the habit of caring about things that don't immediately benefit you. I drove my father to his appointments because he needed me to, not because I was keeping score. I learned his medication schedule because it mattered to get it right. And when something fell off about that February amendment, I didn't dismiss it as paranoia or grief. I followed the thread carefully because I'd spent years learning what careful actually looks like. My brother mistook that carefulness for passivity. He thought quiet meant unaware. He thought tired meant done. What I've come to understand, not from this situation alone, but from all of it, from the caregiving years and the court date and everything after, is that the way you treat people when nothing is at stake is actually the most important thing about you. Not the big dramatic moments, the small ones. Whether you stop on a wet sidewalk, whether you file things properly, whether you tell the truth when a lie would be easier and no one would likely catch it. Walter was a retired judge with decades of experience, yes, but he was also just an older man with mismatched gloves who needed someone to help him over a crack in the pavement. I didn't help him because I thought he could do something for me. I helped him because it was the obvious thing to do. And I think that matters. Not in some cosmic, fated way. I don't believe the universe was arranging things on my behalf. I believe that people who act with integrity tend, over time, to find themselves in rooms with other people who also act with integrity. That's not magic. That's just how trust moves through the world. The intelligence I needed wasn't brilliance. It was patience. It was the willingness to read a nursing assessment carefully, to photograph an email thread, to find a lawyer who specialized in exactly this, and then tell her everything without editing myself. It was knowing that I didn't know enough to do it alone, and asking for help precisely and without embarrassment, and the endurance part, that one I understood by the end. 3 years of caregiving had already tested it. The court process was just another form of the same thing. Show up, pay attention, don't quit because it's taking longer than you expected. My father used to say that the people who matter are the ones who show up. I think he was right. I think he'd be glad I did.